Hello everyone, MasterZeon1001 here, and in this video we'll be going over some of the changes and updates that have happened in the latest version of Boxcutter 717_17. There's a lot that's going on with this, with a new repeat system, improvements to N-gon, and a fine send-off to grid. However, we'll be starting off with Wedge, so without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into it. So here I am in Blender 2.83.12 using last week's Boxcutter 717.16, and if we were to draw a box, we could press W and it will allow us to wedge, and we could press W again, it will allow us to flip that just on the fly in case we need to wedge it from a different angle, and that's nice and all. However, let's say I wanted to draw a box and I did not want this to be wedge. Well, I see at the top it says wedge box, so if I press W, nothing happens, but it did rotate the wedge, but it can't be seen because we have a 2D shape. So if we press W again, we see that it removes it, and now we're able to get back to box. And so it's just like that you're able to get out of wedge box. And really I found that that was a little bit unintuitive as far as getting in and out of the wedge box state. So for that, we sought to improve it in this latest update. So minimizing that, I'm now in 2.93.0 using 717.17. And we can say draw a box, and there's our same first cut, and we can press W to just turn this into a wedge box, and here we are able to wedge this just on the fly. And I'll just adjust the auto smoothing real quick. But let's say I'm drawing this box and I decide on the fly I do not want this to be a wedge box. I can press W only once and it will remove that state, allowing me to get in here and perform a wedge. And really that's all there is to it when it comes to using wedge. Now removing and adding wedge is as easy as pressing W, but if you're in an extruded state, pressing W twice will still allow you to rotate wedge at least once prior to its removal. Keep in mind that if you need to rotate the wedge in an alternative direction than the two that we provide, you can use Shift R to rotate the shape inside, and that will allow you to rotate the wedge to any degree that you particularly need. So here I am back in 2.83.12 using yesterday's Boxcutter. And so the next thing I want to discuss is repeat. So if I were to say draw a box shape and place it, the next thing I could do is hold Control and double click, and I can repeat this shape. And repeat is pretty easy in terms of putting like little micro detail. You can just Control click and double click, and it's just really fun to repeat things. However, repeating things with precision can always become a little bit of a struggle. So let's go ahead and make a new file, and keep in mind that I'm using the previous version of Boxcutter. And one thing I want to show is how I would draw this shape with N-gon, and then I would just repeat it using Shift to Live. Notice that I'm having to draw this off of the mesh because it's always been hard to orient this vert with this vert. So that's just life, you know, but I've always hated that. So we'll just shift it to live. And I don't even need it live. I can just go back to, I can press 1, get rid of that. And we'll just press D, switch over to box, and I'm just going to Control Shift double click. And now I can repeat this shape. And now I can Control Shift double click and repeat this shape. And it's kind of a game of wits whenever you're playing with repeat in this fashion, but it allows you to get these really interesting step shapes. And what I'll do is, forget about that. We'll come back and grab this area, extract it with Y, and now we have this really interesting layered cutter that we can bring in at like a more variable depth. And I'll like use this to detail the side of crates and stuff like that, just to really stack up some quick detail. I'll work a cube and then just transfer it to something else. But notice the process that I used with repeat. Another thing I want to show with repeat is that if we were to turn on snapping and we activate snapping dots, whenever we use snap dots will just break down repeat. So let's draw this shape again. There's our shape, and we want to repeat it on this dot. That's just not going to happen. Keep in mind that we can repeat it on the surface just by Control double clicking. We can just repeat it on the surface, but I've always hated how it never worked with dots, and this was something that was always a bit of a nuisance and one of my least favorite support issues, because it meant having to admit defeat, that the system's just incomplete, and it's just not any better at this moment. It's just incomplete. However, today that changes. So here we are back in 717.17, and I just want to show how repeat has changed. So we'll just draw a box, And there we are, just drawing our quick wedge box. And I'm just going to control double click and we'll repeat it again. And you probably are thinking, you know, that looks a lot like the last repeat. Well, let's take a moment and talk about repeat lock or release lock. Release lock is a breakdown of all the behaviors that we have inside of Boxcutter. Normally you draw a shape and then when you release your mouse, you're able to extrude. However, we took some steps towards dissecting that and allowing you to turn on release lock in order to turn this into a stepped process. So now you can draw the shape, pause, rotate around, you know, get reflective with it, and then finally grab the dot and begin transitioning into the next step. And this can be handy for users of varying accessibility types. However, the interesting thing about repeat lock is shift clicking it brings up a sub panel. And new to this version, we've added something called repeat lock. And this was actually the formal request, was actually to add the ability to use repeat lock, but it expanded into so much more because repeat was simply a system that was incomplete. So now if we control double click, we see that the shape has been placed. We can press G and grab it. We can move it around. We can do it again. We can control double click to just place this shape. G, grab it, move it around, and this just unlocks the ability to use repeat in a way that we never could before. And at this time, you probably noticed that, you know, I've just been avoiding the dots, and truth be told, I'm not. So let's press Alt X to put a mirror modifier on this and split this in between. And now we have a line going down the middle. So if I were to control double click, this is now placed precisely on that line. However, you don't see the boolean because the hotline is being exposed. If we were to press Z, we can see that this boolean is sitting precisely on this area, which is why another task in design is the ability to switch between fast and exact on the fly. But that's not what we're talking about here today. Depending on your draw type, you can actually utilize these dots in very creative ways. Because I drew this as a corner drawn shape, it's just not going to work out when being repeated in the middle of an edge that's happening right here. So if we were to draw the shape but hold Alt, we're just drawing the shape, and now when we repeat it, it's actually a center drawn shape. We could press Z to do a wire see-through, and just like that, we're able to easily repeat this shape without any issue or unpredictability, allowing us to do all sorts of things. The original test was going to show how you can repeat this very predictably on every face of a cube, just over and over and over, even by subdividing. So I might as well show that example. We'll press X, delete, we'll press X, delete it, and we'll just bring in a cube. So I'm just going to subdivide this a couple of times, and you'll see why. And it's because snap dots orients to this. However, that's another point of examination that I plan to get into at some point in the future. That system also remains incomplete. What we have right now is cursory, but I definitely want something to finish the job. And we're definitely going to be getting there, as you'll be seeing as we go on with this video. So I'm just drawing an area and just extracting it with Y by drawing a box around it. And we have all these snap points. So I'm just going to draw from here, but I'm going to press period because I could hold Alt or Shift, or I could just press period, and that will allow me to center draw. And we just bring this shape out, and that's our shape. And now we can just go through and repeat this, and that's all there is to it. However, one of the things that you might notice is that repeat lock is kind of getting in the way. Really, I don't need repeat lock because I'm actually confident that it's going to repeat exactly as I want. So here we are, just going through, stacking these over and over. I have some sort of twitch that's making me continually deselect objects. I don't know what's happening. All this cold weather, I guess. So we continue on, just repeating this, and you can see that, you know, this video isn't a long take. I'm not even, you know, doing pauses in between these sections to break them down because I've tested this over and over. However, here I've broken a rule, so now I'm stuck on the other side. It looks like about 6 cuts ago, I grabbed one of the wrong dots that was created by a subdivision instead of sticking with the ones that are actually created on the cube by my initial subdivisions. So in the future, we plan to be coming back and revising grid as well, but I just want to show how repeat can now be used in a very predictable manner. And this is just the start of our repeat system and its improvements. So without further ado, let's move on to the next part. In addition to the things I talked about previously with our face dot support with repeat, we'll just draw a custom shape of a Boxcutter logo. Go figure. We'll press VV in order to make this a radial array. Just roll it around a couple of times and we will just click to apply. And for this, I will shift click and turn on repeat lock through the release lock panel. And just by grabbing this face dot, we can actually place this here. And notice that while we repeated this radial array, we also repeated it in a live state, which means that we can grab this displacement dot and still move this out in a radial fashion in the middle of this cut, even though we're in the middle of basically a repeat of the last cut. So we can even grab this dot and adjust the scale, change the scale of our logo, and of course to click and apply to complete it. So we'll do the same thing here. Control double click and we see that we've actually repeated the last cut that we had when we manipulated here, which is something that I don't want. I'll hold shift and get it back to something more square. And we can even adjust the radial distance, maybe even bring it a little bit closer. And from here, let's control double click and repeat it on the next face. And we can select the object, control double click, and grab the displacement dot to move it around. One of the things I plan to revisit is resume, which is where you grab the dot and it doesn't actually jump to a neutralized position. It stays in the current position before you begin dragging. There's always more work to be done. So by clicking and applying, I believe you guys get the idea when it comes to getting in here and playing with radial array and even repeating it and having it live on the fly. And I could even get in here and press V in order to re-array it, in case you're wondering, and set that up once again and get in and adjust it. Press Control D to bring up my settings, and we can go in the behavior panel and specifically set array to the amount that we want, even on a repeat. Let's press Shift A, add a cube, move it over to the side, and we'll just Control double click to repeat this. Press Control D and adjust the count on the fly. So even if there isn't a fluid option available, there's always an option available for you to get the option that you want. Or at least that's what we aim for. So by pressing Control D, we can get in here, add more segments if needed, grab our displacement dot to make this something wider. And from here, we've actually destroyed our top dot, which would normally show up. But always hack the dots by just subdividing geometry, because I know if there's a vert, a dot's going to be there. And so even though this object has things penetrating into it, making it an N-gon face, causing irregular dot fashions to show up, we can still Control double click and repeat this shape just as we would normally. N-gon also has repeat capabilities, so here I am rotating the shape and just holding Alt to snap it to front, and we'll press D, switch to N-gon, and we'll just begin drawing a shape, and we will just repeat by Control double clicking. Even while we're in N-gon, we can still have repeat lock on and Control double click and just repeat this shape just as we would in Box. So now you can repeat with a little more confidence than you could previously. I always have to admit that repeat previously felt a little random inside of Boxcutter, and that was something that I always meant to double back for and make feel a little bit more sane. So here I am extracting the same area where I can then redraw it with a little bit less depth differential to create a really interesting shape, but you get the idea. So for this example, I have a subdivided cube, as you can see here, and all this geometry is still alive since I'm still able to go through and scroll through to booleans. So what I'll do is first draw a box around it, press W once to get out of Wedge box, and we'll just cut through it, press Y in order to perform an extraction, and now we've extracted it. Currently I have repeat lock on, as you can see here. By shift clicking the release lock button, we're able to bring up this little sub panel, and now that I have this, I'm able to hold control and we'll just draw from this one, but I'll press period in order to draw this shape out using the center draw. And we'll just pull this out, hold shift to get it proportional, and we'll just tab to live to hold it here. So while I can press R and rotate this if I needed to, I'm just going to, for the sake of this example, just click and apply. So now if I were to double click, it repeats exactly as it was oriented the moment I drew it previously. But let's take this and actually rotate it 90 degrees and click and apply. So now the next time that I repeat this, it will repeat exactly as I oriented it previously. And this will continue, as I double click these points. So just letting you know that improvements have been had with the way that rotation is taken into consideration even between the repeat process. So on this last row, we'll just double click here. We'll rotate this 90 and maybe even offset a little bit and just click in place. And we'll just double click, and we're still able to repeat this exactly as we drew it. Of course, offset isn't yet taken into consideration, and the standard argument for this is why not just use an array, which of course you can just pause it, press V and activate array, and move your mouse in order to adjust the amount of array, pressing Shift R to completely reset it if things get off screen. And just like that, you can quickly clone an object. But just letting you know that repeat is now stronger than ever, where even if you have something set up like this where you arrayed it previously, you can go back in and repeat it with the array on it, just like you see. And we'll select this, locate a dot, and we'll repeat here, press V in order to adjust the array. And notice that because of the non-destructive behavior, that it's now able to keep that array live even when I'm repeating it. So I can just click and apply this, jump over to the next phase, and here I am with this same repeat, same array, same shape. I can press V, adjust it. Resume will be something that I plan to deal with in future releases. However, it is something that isn't far from my mind. So now we'll just grab another point and just repeat this and so forth. And just like that, you can see how repeat has been strengthened in this particular release. N-gon has received a plethora of improvements this release. So here I am using Boxcutter 717.16, which is now the old version, over in 2.83.12, my favorite LTS. And we'll just press D and switch over to N-gon. So with N-gon, you start off drawing a shape, and your first line actually dictates your orientation. I've always hated that. So that means if we drew a line freely, as in we didn't hold control to snap, we just drew a line freely, and then we began using snapping, our snapping is never going to be straight again. And this is something that particularly drove me insane, because sometimes you really need a custom cut, but you don't want to reorient your entire shape because you actually drew your first line at a custom angle. To compare it to something else that I find a little bit more sane, let's look at Blender's own knife tool, where you can draw a knife at any angle. You can click, you can press C, and it will constrain it to a straight view, X and Y, where you can go up and down in a straight line. And sometimes you really need a straight line. And so being able to even get to your first point is something that I've always dreamed of being able to do, even with a knife tool. However, with N-gon, that's never been possible. So if we were to, say, draw an N-gon shape, but we hold control to snap, we can draw everything out, getting it very nice and boxy and sharp on all these other sides. But when it comes to finally sealing this shape up, getting it aligned with this very first point has always been an impossibility, and that's always driven me crazy with our snapping. We should be able to handle that on a basic snapping level, aside from grid. I mean, with grid, first point snapping was solved, meaning that you could go up at the top of Boxcutter and turn on grid, and you could draw your shape, and while you have grid active, you'll at least be able to get reoriented back to your first point smoothly, allowing you to easily box off a shape. But sometimes you don't want grid up. Sometimes you want to be able to do it just without that. But just notice how if you draw the first line randomly, once you begin snapping, your orientation with snapping is actually 45 degrees of the last line instead of something more global. So this has just always been a point of contention with Boxcutter, and just one of those things I've always wanted to double back for, because drawing a shape like this with such angles and being unable to get it straight is just unacceptable. However, while I'm still here, let me show you another issue with Boxcutter that's always driven me insane. If you were to activate grid and you begin drawing off of the mesh, notice where my mouse cursor is, but notice how off the N-gon is. I'm so glad to finally be able to talk smack about this in a video. Sometimes I choose punching bags that are like several versions ago, which is kind of easy prey. But being able to really show how inadequate this current release that is out at this moment is, and how we've sought to improve and how we've improved upon every single aspect that I'm discussing here, is just a point of happiness for me. Another thing with grid that's always driven me crazy is how if you don't click a point on the grid, it actually has like this simulation of being a window. Also notice that that shape is just terrible, but we'll try that again. We're trying to just draw a straight line, and because the mouse is so offset, this will never work out. And this has been the state of N-gon for a moment, and I was just not going to let this go for another day. So with that, let's switch over to the other blender and begin talking about some of these improvements. So off the bat, holding control for angular snap is not my favorite thing. So for this, I'll be turning on angle snap. So if I'm in N-gon, there's a snapping option for angle snap here, or angle lock, which will basically allow you to snap without having to hold control, because holding control is ridiculous. So the first thing I'm going to do is just draw a random line. I'm going to hold control. So I just told you how I don't want to hold control, but I'm going to hold control and draw a random line. And now whenever we begin snapping, notice that I'm now snapped to something more global. And to spoil the next surprise, last point snapping is now a thing. So whenever it comes to getting to the very last point, it is just easier than ever. That is what this little dot is. All that dot is your Navi Fairy to suggest to you what's the next route you could go as far as getting an angle lock going. So right here we see that it just snaps right into place. We're able to angle lock and just extrude this without any issue. Last point snap is just one of those things that I've wanted for so long, and I'm happy to see that it's now a thing inside of Boxcutter. However, the task has already escalated into me needing all point snap and also maybe guidance lines. Seriously need some guidance lines. Even the point display was something I felt needed to be added. So that's been added at the very last minute, because I felt that last point snap really meant nothing unless you could visually see exactly what was being suggested to you. But in the future, we plan to have it extend to all point snap, or maybe a limitation snap, or a snap over the last X points, or something like that. I'm still pondering what direction it could go in, but the first step is always just solving the initial issue. So I'm happy to announce that users of N-gon, if you've been using it for a while, you've probably pondered this as well, about why you can't orient your point to the very final point, to the very first point, in order to, you know, orient and seal off your shape. So that's the first thing that's going on with N-gon, but definitely one of the things that I'm most excited about. Also, you see me keep rotating the view in order to extrude. I could always just double click in order to just perform a calculated laser cut, which is probably a lot easier. And I could even play with laser cut depth to cut it a preset amount of depth, but old habits die hard. That's something that we'll also be needing to correct at some point in the future. But as I always say, there's always more work to be done. So previously I was showing a bug how if you had grid activated and you were inside of N-gon and you drew starting off of the mesh, that your mouse would not be congruent with the shape that you're drawing. So I'm happy to announce that this long time bug has finally been resolved. It was driving me crazy. It was something I couldn't sleep with at night knowing. Currently we are in the process of working on an all new grid, so all this work means nothing, for it will be replaced. However, at this time I just want it to be known that for this, the 17th release of the 717 series, that we've put a lot of work into fixing a lot of the long time bugs that existed within Boxcutter that were just kind of driving us crazy. And so I'm happy to announce that this issue has finally been resolved, and you can now draw starting off of your mesh as you may have always wanted. It looks like at this particular cut I had a hot line that was hitting it right on an edge. That's always a curiosity. Let's press Alt V and activate wireframe just to see what we were doing. I guess we'll never know. But in the event that cut issues happen, sometimes I'll go in my hops drop down, and under the bevel panel, which now extends to booleans as well, you can actually change your boolean to be either fast or exact just on the fly. So sometimes I'll go here and just change a boolean to fast or exact just to see if it improves on it. So sometimes I'll see a cut having error and I'll keep it just to see if exact will cut me a little more slack. Here I am in the LTS with yesterday's Blender, and if we activate grid, we can hold control to begin drawing a grid. And if we were to draw a box and hold control all the way through, now we can see that the grid is drawing in a slightly distorted fashion, and it's always something that is a bit of a curiosity for me because it shows like multiple grids at the same time going different directions at space. It's just a ponder. Of course, the easy solution is to just let go of control and press it again. But the answer to why it happens is because the area that you were currently ray tracing is no longer there, so it's causing some sort of distortion in the time parallax or something. I don't know. But basically, once you do that and you let go of control, you can actually begin drawing the grid again just fine. But I'm happy to announce that that's been resolved in this version as well. So if you were to draw a box and bring it down and continue holding control, you can see now that the grid is still drawing the way it's supposed to. So no more crazy wonky grids going off in space because you have a heavy hand on the control key. You want to see a crazy bug. So right now I have grid on. We hold control. We see that as I hover my mouse over the grid, there's these little snapping dots. If I were to say draw a box and draw another box and then draw a third box but extract it using this box, notice how the grid no longer has snapping dots. Also notice that the moment that I begin drawing from it, it's actually utilizing view, so it's no longer even like casting rays to the grid. It's just the weirdest bug, and whenever I found it, you know, the first response was, well, there's a new grid in the works, so we'll just wait till then. It's like, look at this bug. You can't let this I can't let this sit. This thing cannot sit. So I'm happy to announce that it's been resolved, but just notice how extract will just end dots, end snapping on grid. It's just so ridiculous. Like, I could still kind of orient to the grid with it on the surface, but I feel like it's more than likely using increments or something and not what is being displayed. But who knows? It looks like it is actually orienting to the grid, but the fact that you can't use the grid off the surface and it begins just cutting through it is just terrible. So I'm happy to announce that this issue has been resolved. So we can go over here and we'll just draw a box, and I'm not even going to start off with grid snap. You see that with grid snap on, I have my dot. We can now draw, perform an extraction, and now we can now begin drawing off of the surface. And that's just amazing. This bug has been around for so long and no one noticed it or caught it or anything, but the moment that I caught it, I realized, hey, you know, this thing not only ends your grid's career, it ends your grid's career on your file, and even if you save and reopen, it doesn't come back. So I'm happy to announce that this issue has finally been resolved. So here's another one, another thing that just drove me absolutely batty with the grid. So you have a grid, right? And notice where my mouse cursor is. Like, I'm not actually over the dot. I'm going to select in between the dots. I'm going to select one of these inner cells. And notice that because I did that, I'm now inside a view align. The grid is hollow. And this has always driven me crazy because sometimes I just don't want it to bother with that. Sometimes I want it to just jump to the nearest point that's highlighted instead of actually jumping to view align, because if I'm using the grid like you see me using here, then obviously I want to orient to the grid that I have in front of me. But notice that also whenever I draw a box off the mesh, that it even has the same issue that N-gon did. So that's just been solved all around, by the way. But we'll just do that one more time just to show it. So here I am just drawing, orienting using the grid just off of the mesh because I'm a weirdo. But if I were to bring it off of the mesh and click any cell in between, you'll basically activate view align. And that's not an intended behavior. I mean, really it makes it the dark souls of grids. So I'm happy to announce that in this latest version that if you were to click in between a cell, it will just jump to the nearest dot, which is a lot more sensible, allowing you to use grid a lot lazier, but still be able to get it oriented exactly where you need it and get the result that you're going for that requires grid-like precision. Of course, with grid, you can still roll the wheel to scale it up and down, and then even go in and manually type in parameters depending on what type of grid you're going for. So B for Artists is an alternative build for Blender where it has its load factory defaults hidden under the edit menu to full beginners. But if you go under preferences and you have Boxcutter installed and you enable it, you know, along with HardOps, the first thing you'll notice is that Boxcutter will do something strange to the top bar. And you could tell that the moment that you start Boxcutter. Now that we've started one of our tools, we've now lost our top bar. as far as what was there. So even if we exit the tool, we still have it back, but people wrote me about it on Twitter. So there's actually been a new preference added underneath display. You can scroll down to replace headers, and by toggling off replace headers and saving your preferences, now whenever you start HardOps or Boxcutter, you can see that the options that are normally in the top bar added by B for A are still there. Not recommending this branch by any means, but just letting you know we now support it, at least as far as that goes. So in Boxcutter, there's two types of cuts. There is drawing off of the surface, and then there's drawing on the surface. Whenever you draw on the surface, the shape is actually oriented to the surface where your first click began, which means that the shape is aligned to the surface. However, if you draw starting off of the mesh, you're drawing in what's called view, and the shape is actually aligned to view, which means it will start off of the mesh, meaning you will have to go out and extrude it. So for boxes, this has been improved. So you see how the moment that I draw a shape and I press tab to pause it and rotate the view, you can see that the shape is actually offset a little bit far in space. If we minimize this and we go over to the latest version of Boxcutter, we draw a shape, press tab, we see that even in view, the shape is aligned to the surface a little bit closer than it's ever been before. And so this is something that we will be working towards improving in the future. However, the system that you're seeing here is just the first steps towards getting a better, more boxy align fit when it comes to view align and performing cuts on shapes. But it really comes in handy whenever you're needing to perform a cut like a wedge, starting off of the mesh like right here. Normally the cut would be oriented farther out in space and I would have to bring it back, but now I'm able to extrude it back, press W because we can bring out our wedge, but our wedge isn't going to be oriented correctly. I'll press Shift R to rotate that around, and now we've just wedged off the front of this box using view align, which is something that I've been working towards over the last couple of releases, wanting to make view align when it comes to using it along with boxes a thing. Initially, whenever we added wedge support, we had it just disabled for view align due to the amount of offset that would happen in space initially whenever we use view align. So just letting you know, it's not going to work best with all shapes. However, right now it does improve when it comes to boxes, but in the future I hope to have it work for all shapes, where whenever you draw a shape in alignment with view, it just brings the shape down closer to the surface than normal. A popular support question we get is, why can't I click and drag to create a cut whenever my shape is deselected? Instead, I get this gray box. Why do I get a gray box whenever I don't have my shape selected? And the answer, of course, is select your shape. But I do love sending these messages to the team, letting them know that people are still having an issue with cutting shapes that they don't have selected. So now that you have a shape selected, we're drawing aligned to the object as specified at the top. However, if we were to draw without our cursor over the object, we are drawing using something called view. You wouldn't know that you're using view, except that it just changed to it because you began drawing with your mouse in a position that's not over the mesh. The alternative would have been to have nothing there. But just letting you know that if you begin clicking and dragging with your mouse over the mesh, you will draw over the surface. And if you begin drawing with your mouse off of the mesh, you will perform a view aligned cut. However, in the latest version of Boxcutter, if we were to deselect the object, you can see that whenever I'm using make and world, the text at the top bar is now showing in red to let you know that these have been changed in this state. So I can just draw this box and leave it here and select this shape, and we'll just draw it. And we see that because I'm drawing starting off of the mesh, that I'm utilizing view. And of course it's utilizing view because it's only in accordance with the selected mesh. So we just click to apply and do it once again. We're just drawing aligned to the surface. We see that everything's fine in the top bar, but if we begin drawing without being aligned to the surface, we see that it jumps over to view. So just letting you know that we've taken some steps towards letting it be known whenever parameters are being automatically changed in the case of the view versus surface debate. As always, I'm proud of the work that goes into these releases. What started off as a couple of small bug fixes and a few irritations here and there ended up becoming something major. In fact, internally it was suggested that we should just call this 718, but 718 the number is slated to have something a little bit bigger added to it, so we'll be holding that off. But also, this release is 71717, and you know, we just don't get a lot of opportunities to celebrate those in a big way. So I'm happy to announce that Boxcutter 717 has turned 17, and I hope users find enjoyment in the plethora of improvements and bug fixes that have gone into these updates. Sometimes I see people asking if each update's necessary. These videos are designed to, you know, allow you to make that decision for yourself. I can only just show you the issues that we face and how we aim to solve them, and then it's up to you to decide if you want to go ahead and access your marketplace and get the latest update. But I'm ranting at this point, so I'll just wrap this up, and I thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.